Before you begin, write in the comments which city and country you're watching us from. This channel exists to record stories that should never have been forgotten. In 1839, in a small town in North Carolina, a young woman was buried in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of a plantation cemetery. No church service was held, no eulogy was spoken. Her name was deliberately omitted from all official records. But in the weeks following her death, 3 prominent men, a physician, a minister, and a judge, wrote separate letters describing the same woman as the most dangerous mind they had ever encountered. They never explained what they meant. The letters were sealed and hidden in private collections for over a century. What you're about to hear is reconstructed from those documents, medical records that were supposed to be destroyed, and testimony that was struck from court proceedings. This is not folklore. This is what they tried to erase. The town of Ashford, North Carolina, existed in the tense years between the Nat Turner Rebellion and the Civil War, when every Southern community lived in perpetual fear of slave uprisings. The summer of 1839 was particularly oppressive, not just because of the heat, but because of an atmosphere of surveillance and paranoia that had settled over the county like a fog. New laws had been passed, making it a crime to teach enslaved people to read. Patrols had doubled. Any gathering of more than 3 black individuals without white supervision was considered a conspiracy. In this environment, on the Whitmore plantation, there lived a young woman named Sarah. She was 23 years old, born into slavery, and by all appearances she should have been invisible, just another field hand among dozens. But Sarah possessed something that made her an anomaly in a system designed to deny such possibilities, an intellect so profound that it terrified everyone who encountered it. The first recorded incident appeared in the diary of Dr. Edmund Cartwright, the plantation physician, dated June 12, 1839. He had been called to treat an elderly enslaved man suffering from fever. Sarah was present as an assistant, as she often helped with the sick. Dr. Cartwright noted, almost casually, that Sarah had asked him a question about his diagnosis. He had prescribed bloodletting, the standard treatment. Sarah, according to his entry, suggested instead that the fever might be caused by contaminated water from the creek, where animals had recently died upstream. She recommended boiling water and a paste made from willow bark. Dr. Cartwright dismissed her immediately. He was a respected physician trained at the University of Pennsylvania. She was an enslaved woman with no formal education, but 3 days later the patient died following the bloodletting. And in his diary, Dr. Cartwright wrote something strange. The girl knew. How did the girl know? Before we continue, leave a comment below telling us, have you ever encountered knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist? Sarah had never been taught to read. This was documented. The Whitmore family, like most plantation owners, strictly forbade literacy among their enslaved workers. Yet the plantation overseer, Thomas Brennan, reported in August 1839 that he had discovered Sarah examining a medical textbook in Dr. Cartwright's bag while he was visiting a patient. When confronted, Sarah not only read passages aloud with perfect pronunciation, but also corrected several passages, pointing out that the text's description of fever treatment contradicted more recent findings published in Philadelphia medical journals. Journals she could not possibly have accessed. Brennan reported this to Henry Whitmore, the plantation owner. According to Brennan's testimony, later given in a closed legal proceeding, Whitmore's response was immediate and severe. Sarah was to be isolated from the other enslaved people. She was forbidden to enter the main house. She was to be watched constantly. Whitmore wrote in a letter to his brother, preserved in the county historical archives, "We have a problem. The girl Sarah has somehow acquired knowledge that threatens the natural order. If others learn of this, the consequences could be catastrophic." But isolation only intensified the mystery. Sarah was moved to a small cabin at the edge of the property, where she was made to work alone, in the vegetable garden. It was there that the second incident occurred. A traveling preacher named Reverend Marcus Hale visited Ashford in September 1839, conducting revival meetings throughout the county. He was invited to the Whitmore plantation to deliver Sunday services for the enslaved population, a common practice meant to reinforce Christian obedience and submission. Reverend Hale's sermons typically focused on biblical passages that justified slavery, emphasizing duty, patience, and the promise of reward in the afterlife. But something went wrong during his visit to Ashford. In a letter Reverend Hale sent to his bishop, discovered only in 1967 when a church archive was being catalogued, he described an encounter that left him deeply shaken. After his sermon, Sarah had approached him privately and asked if she could pose a theological question. Hale agreed, expecting a simple inquiry about faith or salvation. Instead, Sarah asked him to explain the linguistic origins of specific Hebrew words used in Genesis, then proceeded to offer her own interpretation based on alternative translations from Aramaic sources. She quoted passages from the Talmud. She referenced scholarly debates from European universities. She did all of this, according to Hale's letter, with the precision of a seminary professor, yet speaking from memory without any text before her. Reverend Hale was so disturbed that he cut his visit short. In his letter, he wrote, "I have met scholars at Yale and Princeton with less command of biblical scholarship than this young woman possesses. I cannot explain it. I will not speak of it publicly, for no one would believe me, and if they did, I fear what they would do to her." The Whitmore family learned of this encounter. Their response escalated. Sarah was now considered not just an anomaly, but a threat. In September 1839, Henry Whitmore contacted Judge Samuel Morton, a prominent legal figure in the county, seeking advice on how to handle Sarah within the bounds of law. Judge Morton's response, preserved in his personal correspondence, was chilling in its pragmatism. If the girl possesses unnatural knowledge, she must be declared mentally unfit and confined. If she is not confined, she will inspire others, and we will face rebellion. The law gives you authority to act. But before Whitmore could proceed, a third incident occurred that would draw even more attention to Sarah's impossible abilities. In October 1839, a fire broke out in one of the plantation's tobacco barns, threatening to spread to the other structures and potentially destroy the entire year's harvest. The enslaved workers fought desperately to contain the blaze, using bucket brigades and wet blankets. Sarah, despite being isolated, appeared at the scene without being summoned. According to multiple witnesses, including the overseer Brennan and two white neighbors who had come to help, Sarah immediately assessed the situation and began directing the firefighting efforts. She ordered men to tear down a section of fencing to create a firebreak. She instructed others to soak the roofs of nearby buildings. She predicted correctly that the wind would shift within the hour and sent workers to prepare accordingly. Her commands were so precise, so confident, and so effective that even the white men present found themselves following her instructions. The fire was contained, the harvest was saved, but this act of leadership, this demonstration of intellectual authority, was intolerable. A black woman, enslaved, giving orders to white men and being obeyed. It violated every principle of the social order. Whitmore was furious, not because Sarah had done anything wrong, but because she had done something extraordinary. Dr. Cartwright was called to the plantation once more, this time not to treat an illness, but to conduct a medical examination of Sarah. His report, dated October 18, 1839, is one of the most disturbing documents in this case. In it, Cartwright documented Sarah's physical health, normal in every respect, but then attempted to offer a medical explanation for her intelligence. He concluded that Sarah's mental abilities were the result of a pathological condition, an aberration of the nervous system that caused her brain to function in an abnormal manner. This diagnosis was not based on any scientific evidence. It was a rationalization, a way to categorize Sarah's mind as diseased rather than superior. Because if her mind was not diseased, if her intelligence was natural, then every theory that justified slavery, every claim that black people were intellectually inferior, would be proven false, and that could not be allowed. Dr. Cartwright recommended that Sarah be subjected to treatments to calm the excessive activity of her mind. These treatments included isolation, restriction of mental stimulation, and the administration of sedatives. The goal was not to cure her, but to suppress her. Sarah understood what was happening. According to a fragment of testimony given by another enslaved woman named Eliza, who had been briefly allowed to bring Sarah food during her confinement, Sarah told her, "They fear what I represent more than they fear what I might do. I am evidence of a lie they cannot admit, and for that they will erase me." This is where the documentation becomes fragmented and harder to verify, but the pattern that emerges is consistent across multiple sources. Throughout the autumn of 1839, Sarah was visited by various individuals, some out of curiosity, some out of fear, and some seeking answers that conventional wisdom could not provide. A schoolteacher named Margaret Collins came to the plantation under the pretense of delivering supplies, but later admitted, in a diary entry discovered in an attic in 1923, that she wanted to meet Sarah personally. Collins, who had been educated at a female seminary in Boston, engaged Sarah in a conversation about mathematics. She posed several problems involving geometry and algebra. Sarah solved them instantly, without paper, without hesitation. Collins then asked more complex questions related to calculus, a subject that was at the frontier of mathematical study at the time, and rarely taught even to male university students. Sarah not only understood the questions, but expanded on them, discussing concepts related to limits and derivatives that Collins herself struggled to follow. Collins left the plantation shaken. In her diary she wrote, "I went expecting to find an intelligent woman who had somehow learned beyond her station. What I found was a mind that operates on a level I cannot comprehend. She did not learn these things. She knows them the way one knows how to breathe. It is as if she is accessing knowledge that exists beyond her experience. I do not understand it, and I am frightened by it." Word of Sarah's abilities continued to spread, despite efforts to suppress it. In November 1839, a lawyer named Jonathan Pierce, who was visiting Ashford on business, heard rumors about Sarah and requested permission to meet her. Pierce was a rational man, skeptical of superstition, and he approached the meeting as a curiosity. He brought with him a legal brief he was preparing, involving a complex property dispute. As a test, he asked Sarah if she could read the document. She could. He then asked her opinion on the legal arguments. She offered a counter-argument that was so compelling, so meticulously reasoned, that Pierce later abandoned his original brief and restructured his case around her suggestions. He won, but Pierce did not credit Sarah publicly. He could not. Instead, in a private letter to a colleague, he expressed his discomfort. "I consulted a legal mind superior to my own, and that mind belongs to a woman who exists outside the law. She has no rights, no personhood under our system, yet her intellect surpasses that of most men I know. This is a contradiction I cannot reconcile. I am ashamed to benefit from her insight while knowing she will receive nothing in return." The moral burden of this contradiction weighed heavily on those who encountered Sarah. They could see undeniably that she possessed extraordinary intelligence. But acknowledging that intelligence publicly would require them to confront the foundations of their society. And so, instead, they remained silent, complicit in her erasure. By December 1839, the situation had become untenable for the Whitmore family. Sarah's existence was creating discomfort, raising questions, and attracting attention. Visitors came to the plantation seeking her out, asking questions, testing her. Each encounter confirmed the impossible. Sarah's mind was exceptional, perhaps unparalleled, and this was unbearable. Henry Whitmore convened a meeting with Dr. Cartwright, Reverend Hale, and Judge Morton. No official record of this meeting exists, but its outcome is documented. They decided that Sarah could not be allowed to continue as she was. Her presence, her very existence, was destabilizing. They agreed on a course of action that they would describe as humane and necessary. Sarah was to be declared mentally unfit and committed to an asylum. In 1839, asylums in the South were places of confinement for those deemed socially disruptive. There was no treatment, no hope of release. It was a socially acceptable form of disappearance. But Sarah never reached the asylum. On December 14, 1839, she was found dead in her cabin. The official cause of death recorded by Dr. Cartwright was consumption, tuberculosis. The death certificate was brief, perfunctory. No autopsy was conducted. She was buried the next day in an unmarked grave. Yet in the weeks following her death, the individuals who had been involved in her confinement began to experience a collective unraveling. Dr. Cartwright's practice suffered as he became increasingly obsessed with the case. In his diary entries from late December 1839 through early 1840, he wrote repeatedly about his failure to understand Sarah. He questioned his diagnosis, his treatment, his entire approach. He wrote, "I treated her as if her mind was a disease. But what if her mind was simply beyond my capacity to comprehend? What if the sickness was my inability to see beyond the prejudices I was trained to accept?" Reverend Hale ceased preaching for several months. In letters to his bishop, he expressed a crisis of faith, questioning whether a system that suppressed such a mind could truly be ordained by God. He wrote, "If God creates all minds, and Sarah's mind was as brilliant as I witnessed, then what does it mean that we destroyed her? What does it mean that we had to destroy her to preserve our order?" Judge Morton, in his private journals, confessed to a growing sense of dread. He had authorized Sarah's confinement under the law, but the law itself now seemed to him a mechanism of injustice. He wrote, "I upheld the law. I did what I was supposed to do, but I fear I will be judged for it, if not in this life, then in the next." The most revealing document came from Henry Whitmore himself. In a letter to his brother, dated January 1840, he wrote, "We did what we had to do. We protected our interests, our way of life. But I cannot stop thinking about Sarah. I cannot stop wondering what she could have become if she had been born into different circumstances. I cannot escape the feeling that we destroyed something irreplaceable, not just a person, but a possibility. And I fear that this act will haunt us, not as individuals, but as a nation." In the months following Sarah's death, the plantation experienced a series of misfortunes. Crops failed. Livestock died. Workers fell ill. These events were recorded in plantation logs and county records, though no causal connection was ever established. Still, among the enslaved population, a belief took hold that Sarah's spirit was present, that her suppressed knowledge had not died with her, and that the land itself remembered the injustice. Eliza, the woman who had brought Sarah food during her confinement, was later interviewed by a northern journalist in 1863, after she had escaped to freedom during the Civil War. In this interview, published in an abolitionist newspaper, Eliza described Sarah as a woman who knew things she had no earthly way of knowing. She spoke of Sarah's calm acceptance of her fate, her resignation to the inevitability of her erasure. But Eliza also mentioned something else, something that adds another layer to this mystery. According to Eliza, in the final days before her death, Sarah told her, "They think they are silencing me, but knowledge cannot be silenced. It exists whether they acknowledge it or not. What I know will be known again by others in time. They can bury me, but they cannot bury the truth." These words, whether accurately remembered or embellished over time, suggest that Sarah understood the larger historical forces at play. She was not just a victim of personal malice, but a casualty of a system that required her suppression to sustain itself. Her intelligence was proof that the ideology of racial inferiority was false. And because it was false, it had to be hidden, denied, erased. In the years following Sarah's death, the town of Ashford slowly forgot about her, or rather, they chose to forget. The three men who had been most involved in her case, Dr. Cartwright, Reverend Hale, and Judge Morton, all lived into the 1860s, but none of them ever spoke publicly about Sarah again. Their private writings, however, reveal an enduring preoccupation with her case, a sense of guilt and confusion that never fully resolved. The Civil War came in 1861, and with it, the collapse of the slave system that had made Sarah's suppression necessary. Slavery ended, but the attitudes that had justified it persisted. The belief in racial inferiority, though legally challenged, remained deeply embedded in American culture. And so, even in freedom, black intellectual achievement continued to be questioned, doubted, and minimized. It was not until the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, that Sarah's story began to resurface. A historian named Dr. Rachel Thompson was researching medical records from antebellum North Carolina when she discovered Dr. Cartwright's diary. Intrigued by the references to a woman named Sarah, Dr. Thompson began searching for corroborating documents. She found Reverend Hale's letters in a church archive. She found Judge Morton's journals in his descendant's attic. She pieced together, from fragments, the story of a woman who had been deliberately erased. Dr. Thompson published her findings in 1972 in an academic journal article titled "The Suppressed Genius of Sarah, Intelligence and Racism in Antebellum America." The article received little attention at the time. Most historians dismissed it as speculative, arguing that the evidence was too anecdotal, too reliant on subjective accounts. They questioned whether Sarah's intelligence was as extraordinary as the document suggested, or whether these men had simply been exaggerating out of guilt or astonishment. But Dr. Thompson's research opened a door. Other scholars began investigating similar cases, stories of black individuals in the 18th and 19th centuries who had demonstrated intellectual abilities that defied the prevailing racial ideology. They found cases of self-taught mathematicians, writers, inventors, and scholars who had been systematically marginalized, discredited, or erased. What emerged was a pattern. Intelligence that challenged racial hierarchies was not simply ignored, it was actively suppressed. Because if even one case proved that black intellectual capacity was equal to or greater than white capacity, the entire justification for slavery, segregation, and discrimination would collapse. And so these individuals, these examples of what could be, were treated as aberrations, as threats, as problems to be solved. Sarah was one of these individuals, but her case was unique in how thoroughly documented her suppression was. The men who suppressed her could not help but write about her. They were haunted by her, and in their haunting they left a record. In 1995, a group of historians and community activists in North Carolina attempted to locate Sarah's grave. They searched the area around the old Whitmore plantation, which had long since been divided and sold. The original cemetery no longer existed. Most of the markers had been removed or destroyed over the years. They found no trace of Sarah's burial site. It remains unknown. But the search itself was significant. It represented an acknowledgement that Sarah's story mattered, that her erasure was a loss, and that the act of remembering her was an act of resistance against the historical forces that had tried to make her disappear. In 2003, a historical marker was placed near the site of the former Whitmore plantation. It reads, in memory of Sarah, an enslaved woman of extraordinary intelligence, whose life and death reflect the brutal suppression of black intellectual achievement in the antebellum South. Her story, deliberately erased, is now remembered. The marker does not explain how Sarah acquired her knowledge. It does not resolve the mystery. Because the mystery is not just about Sarah. It is about the countless others like her, whose abilities were denied, whose potential was destroyed, whose names we will never know. Sarah's story is both specific and symbolic. It is a documented case of one woman's suppression, and it is a representation of a broader historical crime. What makes Sarah's case particularly haunting is not just what happened to her, but what might have happened if she had been allowed to flourish. What contributions could she have made? What knowledge could she have shared? What could she have taught the world? These questions are unanswerable, and that is the tragedy. Her potential was extinguished before it could be realized. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Sarah's story is the way it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about knowledge itself. How do we acquire knowledge? Where does intelligence come from? Sarah's contemporaries could not explain her abilities within the framework they understood. They described her knowledge as unnatural, as something that should not exist. They struggled to reconcile what they witnessed with what they believed to be true. Some of the men who encountered Sarah speculated that she must have secretly learned to read as a child, that she must have somehow accessed books and memorized vast amounts of information without anyone knowing. But this explanation does not account for the depth of her understanding. Sarah did not simply memorize facts. She engaged with complex concepts, made connections, offered original insights. She reasoned, she analyzed, she created. Dr. Cartwright, in one of his final diary entries about Sarah, written shortly before his own death in 1867, posed a question that he could never answer. What if Sarah's mind was simply operating on a level that our current understanding of human intelligence cannot explain? What if there are forms of cognition, ways of knowing, that we have not yet discovered? And what if, by suppressing her, we destroyed not just a person, but a window into those possibilities? This question remains. Modern neuroscience has expanded our understanding of intelligence, but there are still aspects of human cognition that remain mysterious. There are individuals throughout history who have demonstrated abilities in mathematics, music, language, memory that seem to defy conventional explanation. They are called prodigies, savants, geniuses. But these labels often obscure more than they reveal. They categorize without explaining. Sarah was one of these individuals. But unlike celebrated prodigies who were nurtured and supported, Sarah was destroyed. And the reason was simple. Her existence threatened a social order that depended on her inferiority. In recent years, Sarah's story has been taught in some universities as part of courses on the history of racism, the history of science, and the history of intellectual suppression. Students read the primary documents, Dr. Cartwright's diary, Reverend Hale's letters, Judge Morton's journals. They discuss the ethical implications. They debate whether Sarah's intelligence was as extraordinary as described, or whether it was only perceived as extraordinary because it violated expectations. But these debates, while intellectually valuable, sometimes miss the point. Whether Sarah was the most brilliant mind of her generation or simply a very intelligent woman is not the central issue. The central issue is that her society could not tolerate her intelligence because of her race and her status. The central issue is that a system built on dehumanization requires the suppression of any evidence that contradicts its core assumptions. The central issue is that Sarah was erased, and that erasure was not an accident. It was a necessity. There is a final document that deserves mention. In 2011, a descendant of Henry Whitmore donated a collection of family papers to the North Carolina State Archives. Among these papers was a small leather-bound notebook that had belonged to Sarah. It is the only known artifact directly connected to her. The notebook contains several pages of handwritten text in an elegant script, clearly written by someone with education and skill. The content is a series of mathematical equations, geometric diagrams, and what appear to be notes on natural philosophy, the precursor to modern physics. The existence of this notebook raises immediate questions. If Sarah was illiterate, as the plantation records claimed, who wrote these notes? If she was literate, how did she learn? And if these notes are indeed hers, how did she acquire knowledge of advanced mathematics and science in the 1830s, in an environment that actively prevented her from accessing such education? The notebook has been analyzed by experts in historical documents and mathematics. The equations are accurate, the diagrams are precise, the handwriting is consistent throughout. But no one can definitively prove that the notebook belonged to Sarah. There is no signature, no name. The attribution comes from family tradition, passed down through generations of Whitmores, who claimed that the notebook was found in Sarah's cabin after her death and kept by Henry Whitmore as a curiosity, a reminder of the woman who had troubled him so deeply. If the notebook is authentic, it is physical evidence of Sarah's intellectual abilities. It is proof that she not only possessed knowledge, but recorded it, preserved it, attempted to leave a trace of herself for the future. And if that is true, then her final words to Eliza take on new meaning. They can bury me, but they cannot bury the truth. The truth, in this case, is not a simple narrative of injustice. It is something more complex, more disturbing. It is the recognition that human potential is shaped not just by individual ability, but by the social structures that either nurture or destroy it. Sarah's intelligence, whether extraordinary or merely remarkable, was wasted. It was treated as a threat rather than a gift, and that waste, that destruction, was carried out by people who believed they were acting reasonably, who believed they were protecting their society, who believed they were doing what was necessary. This is what makes Sarah's story so difficult to process. The men who suppressed her were not monsters. They were ordinary people operating within a system that defined their morality, their rationality, their sense of order. They feared what Sarah represented because accepting her would require them to dismantle everything they knew. And so they chose, consciously or unconsciously, to destroy her rather than change. And in that choice, they revealed the true function of racism, not just to oppress, but to prevent the recognition of shared humanity. Because once you recognize that a person possesses the same intellectual capacity as you, the same potential, the same worth, you can no longer justify their subjugation. You are forced to see them as equal. And for a system built on inequality, that recognition is fatal. Sarah understood this. In her conversations with those who visited her, she reportedly expressed no anger, no bitterness, only a kind of resigned awareness. She knew that her intelligence was not the problem, their inability to accept it was. She knew that she was not the aberration, the system that required her suppression was. And so she waited. She submitted to the examinations, the confinement, the treatments. She did not resist violently because she knew resistance would be futile. Her intelligence told her that the forces arrayed against her were too powerful, too entrenched. Her only hope was that her story, her existence, would be remembered, that someday someone would find the documents, piece together the truth, and recognize what had been lost. That recognition is what we are left with. Sarah's story does not offer redemption or closure. It offers only the uncomfortable truth that brilliance, when it appears in an oppressed body, is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a potential to be realized. And that this treatment is not a relic of the past, but a pattern that continues in different forms to this day. The grave remains unmarked. The notebook, if it is hers, sits in an archive, accessible to researchers but largely unknown to the public. The town of Ashford no longer exists. Its name was changed, its history obscured by time and development. The Whitmore plantation has been replaced by subdivisions and shopping centres. There is no physical trace of Sarah's life, no monument, no memorial beyond the historical marker placed in 2003. But her story persists. It persists in the documents that could not be fully destroyed. It persists in the writings of the men who were haunted by her. It persists in the questions that her life and death raise, questions about intelligence, about race, about the nature of knowledge itself. And perhaps most importantly, it persists as a reminder of all the other Sarahs, the unnamed, the unrecorded, the erased. For every documented case of suppressed black intelligence, there are countless others that left no trace, no record, no story to be recovered. They are lost to history, their potential extinguished, their names forgotten. Sarah's story is their story too. It is a testament to what was destroyed and what could have been. It is a record of an intelligence that should never have been feared, a life that should never have been wasted, and a crime that should never be forgotten. The documents exist. The grave remains unfound, the questions persist, and the silence that once surrounded Sarah's story has been broken, not because justice was served, but because the truth, once recorded, cannot be completely erased. It can be hidden, denied, suppressed for generations, but eventually, someone will find it. Someone will read the letters, the diaries, the journals. Someone will piece together what happened, and in that piecing together, the act of erasure is itself erased. This is Sarah's legacy, not her intelligence, which remains mysterious, not her achievements, which were stolen from her, but the fact that her story survived, that despite every effort to make her disappear, she is remembered, that her existence, however briefly, troubled the men who tried to forget her. That her mind, however suppressed, left an impression that could not be fully removed. And in that survival, there is something that approaches hope, not for Sarah, whose life ended in an unmarked grave, but for the principle that truth, however uncomfortable, however delayed, will eventually surface. That history, however manipulated, cannot be entirely rewritten. That memory, however fragmented, persists. The story ends where it began, in documents, in fragments, in questions without answers. We know Sarah existed. We know she was intelligent. We know she was destroyed because of that intelligence. We know the men who destroyed her were haunted by what they had done. And we know that her story was almost lost, but wasn't. What we don't know is how to reconcile these facts with our understanding of human nature, of justice, of progress. We don't know how to measure the loss of potential that her death represents. We don't know how many others like her existed, unnamed and unrecorded. We don't know whether her notebook truly belonged to her, or what other knowledge she might have possessed that was never documented. We are left with uncertainty, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point. Sarah's story resists easy interpretation. It resists closure. It forces us to sit with the discomfort of unanswerable questions, to acknowledge the limits of historical recovery, and to confront the reality that some crimes cannot be fully understood or atoned for. They can only be remembered. So we remember Sarah, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, not as a historical curiosity, but as a person, a woman whose intelligence was feared rather than celebrated, whose potential was destroyed rather than developed, and whose story was almost erased but survived. That survival is not redemption, but it is something. It is a refusal to let the erasure be complete. It is an acknowledgement that she lived, that she mattered, and that the injustice of her death still echoes. The grave may be unmarked, but the story is known. And as long as it is known, as long as it is told, Sarah has not been completely erased. the intelligence they refused to see, the gift they buried. It remains visible, not in what she was allowed to accomplish, but in what she represented, a possibility that threatened an entire system and paid the price for that threat. This is what they tried to hide. This is what we now know, and this is what we must not forget. If you found this story as unsettling as we did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've heard of other erased stories from history. These narratives need to be preserved.